Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Talks by Cartan. Today is a better special, and we have a unique story of the roots of the Paralympics sports, and it's a story that it's been untold and it hasn't been highlighted as much, and this is what it's good about this space to get these stories. And thank you, David, for being here. He's the author of his newly book called Wheels of Courage, and talks about how wheelchair basketball started to develop and how it influenced Paralympic sports, and it was also a social movement in the U.S. So thank you, David, for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ronnie. I really appreciate it. And hello to all the Cartan audience. Here's my coffee.
Nice. Cheers.
Cheers.
So, David, how did you start in this journey? How did you start getting involved with your research on wheelchair basketball with the World War II veterans? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Actually, it came from doing some research on my previous book, which we were discussing a little bit before, the biography of Duke Kahanamoku, of course, the great Olympic swimmer from Hawaii. Yeah. And he spent some time in Southern California in the 1920s. It was the only time Duke lived outside of Hawaii for a long period of time. And, you know, when he would make appearances, the media would write about him because he was, you know, famous as an Olympic swimmer. And one of the places that he swam at sort of caught my attention when I was doing the research because it mentioned the name of a team from of a wheelchair basketball team called the Rolling Devils. And, you know, that name just sounded so, you know, different and evocative. And I went, oh, what is this? I'd never heard about this. And as it turns out, this place where Duke swam, by 1941, it had been turned into a naval hospital for the US Navy. And by around 1946, 1947, there was indeed one of the first ever wheelchair basketball teams, and they were called the Rolling Devils. And that was what started me on this journey and what made it even more, I guess, close to home in some ways. And I should mention Corona, the Naval Hospital's in Corona, which is about 50 miles due east of downtown Los Angeles. And that's where I live, Los Angeles. And it turned out that there was one surviving member from the team. And once I was in contact with him and we started talking, that's when it sort of went to me, okay, this is a book. This is something that I want to look into. And that's what started me on the journey.
Yeah, so you followed three athletes, right? One of them being Johnny Winterholler, and so your book focuses on narrating the story of these three athletes and the story of how wheelchair basketball started. So let's backtrack a little. World War II veterans that were wounded and were paralyzed by the war in the Battle of Bulge. How do you pronounce that? Sorry about it.
Battle of the Bulge and other places.
Battle of the Bulge in Okinawa. And then in the U.S., like basically the people that were paralyzed, they said they had no hope, no, and then they started to go into rehabilitation. How it's? Can you tell us about how that process went? How that went to wheelchair basketball?
Sure. So before World War II, if you were paralyzed or you know had paraplegia, let's say you fought in World War I or you were in a mining accident, chances are your outcome was negative. They did a little bit of a statistical survey. If you were wounded in World War I and were paralyzed, 80% or so would be dead within about 18 months. And the reason for that was there was no antibiotics. There was no such thing as penicillin and sulfa drugs. And so most of those people who did suffer from paraplegia back then, they passed away, unfortunately, because of disease, sepsis, bacteria, bed sores that would just get worse, and the doctors could do nothing. And just as you said, they were called no-hopers and dead enders because the medical community could not combat the diseases back then. If you fast forward to World War II, that's a game changer because by then you have sulfa drugs, which were used on the battlefield to staunch wounds. You had surgical units that were placed right behind the front lines. You had better evacuation techniques. In other words, you could be flown home sooner versus World War I. Of course, it would take maybe months before you would be able to get home. And then the key part was the penicillin, which could fight the bacteria and other diseases that would spring up around paraplegia. And the last component on this, which is what leads us to wheelchair basketball, is once the men got home, and in the US, it was estimated that there were 2,500 paralyzed veterans who came home from World War II, whether they were wounded at Battle of the Bulge or Okinawa or were in Japanese POW camps. They were treated at the VA hospitals, the Veterans Administration hospitals, and they decided on a different type of technique in terms of getting these men better. And it was just, as you say, rehabilitation. And it's really the first time that these men, paralyzed veterans, were offered this opportunity and that the doctors embraced rehabilitation as a way to get better. And part of that was exercise, and the ... from exercise was wheelchair basketball. So that's the origin. And there, we can go into why wheelchair basketball was a particular sport that was good for
that lined up my next question. I mean, why wheelchair basketball? I mean, why that sport? I mean, this story, it's just it caught my eye because it tells a story of human adaptability, and
Right.
even if they tell you that there's no hope, there's always a solution,
Right.
And the story that you tell, it just tells this story describes this perfectly of how human can adapt. But how did that evolve from rehabilitation to wheelchair basketball? I mean, because there's other ways to do rehab.
Right. Well, as you say, the rehabilitation from the medical perspective, wheelchair basketball was about rehabilitation. And by that, it was two components. One is physical. So one of the most important aspects with paraplegia in terms of getting better, you have to strengthen the upper body, the chest, the shoulders, the arms, wrists even. Because let's face it, you now are in a situation, someone with paraplegia, the legs are now useless. So you're going to need your upper body to move around, to help facilitate movement, to wheel your wheelchair. So on a very basic level, basketball was a great exercise for the upper body. So, passing the ball, shooting the ball from a wheelchair to a 10-foot basket, not so easy. Manipulating your wheelchair at the same time as you're trying to, play a sport. So there were a lot of physical aspects that were going on. In England, which was simultaneously working physical exercise into rehabilitation, they started to do archery. That was their first sport. And it's the same principle, the chest and the arms and strengthening.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very important. So the other aspect, so we talk about the physical aspect of rehabilitation for wheelchair basketball, but I think equally important was the psychological aspect of getting better, which is to say, think about the situation. You're a young man in your 20s, and you go to war to fight, for your country, and you come home and you have a devastating, life-altering, permanent injury where you are going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of your life. Um, that's a devastating blow, as you can imagine, for these young men, for anybody. And certainly getting some sort of normalcy, for lack of a better word, into their lives was important. And sports being one of those outlets, both physically was a great method, but also psychologically, that you could do something and do something well in an athletic form was very attractive. And a lot of these men embraced that. And it was, at the bottom line, it was fun. It's fun,
Yeah.
playing sports.
And it was a reason to, it became a purpose to live, no? And I mean,
Exactly.
like, if you get, as you said, you're in your 20s, you come back from war, you were fighting for your country, and then they tell you, no, it's hopeless, your situation is hopeless, and then they give you this outlet of sport. I mean, the power of sport, again, it's huge. And I mean, it's a really unique story that it has. I mean, as I said earlier, it hasn't been all told, and you're sharing this story to the world that most of people don't know about. So I think
Right.
it's very valuable, and congrats, David, on writing this. It's really good.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
I mean, and this became big at the time in America. I mean, in historiographical terms, content, like it was a time of unity in America, and people were following sports. And there was a time where they have a wheelchair basketball game in Madison Square Garden. There were a lot of attendance, no? Like around 15,000.
Right.
What was that game about? Is that something from the professional league that then became, or how did how that wheelchair basketball evolved to being that attracting that much of a crowd?
Right. Well, once wheelchair basketball was established in the VA hospitals, and the men were, out there having a good time playing, scrimmaging with one another. Maybe they would play an able-bodied team who would borrow wheelchairs for the occasion, and they would play a game or scrimmage, oftentimes, by the way, to raise money for the cause, to help research paraplegia, etc. But once you start playing, the competitive urge gets in you, and the VA hospital, the teams in the VA hospitals said, "Hey, we want to play the other VA hospital team," and so it became a thing. And I'm going to share. Well, you asked about the Madison Square Garden, and then I'll show you a photo in a second.
Perfect. Yeah.
Basically, what happened was one of the teams in Southern California, which was the Birmingham VA hospital team in Van Nuys in the Valley, they became known as the Flying Wheels. And again, a really evocative name. And partly it was because they began to barnstorm across the nation, and they would play other VA teams in Massachusetts, in New York, where there were several VA hospitals.
How many
I think
teams
Kansas City,
were in the Navy?
Memphis, Richmond. They went all around, and they would play exhibitions and play these teams. And it became very, very popular. And you mentioned, at this time, this is 47, 48, the US was in a mood very supportive of the veterans, and very supportive of seeing these men playing wheelchair basketball, which was had never been seen before. So it started a bit of a buzz, and this game at Madison Square Garden, they played before a Knicks game, a New York Knicks game, and this is before the NBA had even started. And it was at the old Madison Square Garden, over 15,000 people.
This
The
was
VA,
in the 40s, like late 1940s.
1948, yeah.
Okay.
And the team from Massachusetts came down to play the VA team from Staten Island. And it was a big deal. It was written up in all the papers. And I'm gonna share the screen here. Let's see if I can get this going. Hang on, this is not, give me a moment. I'm not the best technology.
No, there we go.
Okay, can you see that?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, Newsweek magazine.
That's the cover of Newsweek magazine, 1948. That's one of the players on the Staten Island team. His name is Jack Gerhardt. He was wounded at Normandy. And not only is that, pretty cool that he's on the cover of Newsweek, but think about it also from the perspective of, look at the photograph, look at the image. Here's a guy in a wheelchair, and yet he's also athletic at the same time.
Yeah.
And this is at a time when, frankly, disability there was a stigma attached to disability. Not too long before that, when you had the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had polio when he was younger.
True.
He basically would never be photographed in his wheelchair. It was because he didn't want to show weakness. He didn't want to show vulnerability as the President of the United States. So this was a major accomplishment that somebody would, first of all, go around the country playing wheelchair basketball, but also sort of show off that, hey, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to be okay. We may need some help on some things. And this is at a time when there were no curb cutouts. There was no, handicap parking. There were no buses that would sink down to help people in wheelchairs. So it was a very public display of this disability, and that was also very important. And I'll stop sharing the screen now. Yeah.
No, great. Thanks, David. And yeah, I mean, as you said, it's this sort of creates a whole different perspective on paraplegics and like how, as you said, like it was a social movement, of like equal rights for individuals with disabilities. Like as you said, like it was time there was no like ramps, and this changed the view, and I mean it became a global movement. No, I mean this is probably influenced other countries, and then do you think this is the root of the origin of the Paralympic Games, or what do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. But it's not, just to clarify, at the same time as this was happening in the United States, simultaneously it was happening in England. And your audience and people at Cartan who know the history of the Paralympics and the Olympics will know some of this story, which is that in England, at their spinal cord injury unit, which was at Stoke Mandeville outside of London, there was a doctor there named Dr. Ludwig Guttmann. He had been born and raised in Germany. He was Jewish, and so he fled the Nazis just before the war really broke out. He ended up in England. In 1945-46, he was put in charge of the spinal cord injury unit at Stoke Mandeville. And Dr. Guttmann was following the same ideas and principles of rehabilitation as what was happening in the US at the VA hospitals. He went a little bit different route. Like I said previously, he did archery first. He did a and I'm just going to try to find this photo. He did a different version of basketball that was called netball.
Netball,
And
yeah.
yeah, and I'm going to.
That's well played in Australia too now. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's a photo of netball in the early days, and that's Stoke Mandeville Hospital, and you can see it very different wheelchairs. Those are, and by the way, those are sort of the old school wheelchairs that used to be, and you can see those are not for mobility very much. Those are like living room chairs.
That looks hard. Yeah.
And you can, it's an interesting photo because you can see the net has been lowered from 10 feet. It was a different sport. Netball has no backboard, that sort of thing. But in terms of, and I'll stop sharing that photo. In terms of the Paralympics origin, that really starts, the impetus starts with Dr. Gutman. He was a very savvy promoter. One thing, again, for your audience, he starts the Stoke Mandeville Games in 1948. And all it was a competition in archery between two sets of veterans in wheelchairs. And what does he do? He times it for the opening ceremony of the 1948 London Olympics.
Yeah.
And
nice.
You might say that's a coincidence. Dr. Gutman very early on tried to align the Paralympics, which becomes a real word in like 1952 or 1953, with the Olympic movement. And he does all sorts of things, which I detail in the book. He uses like the opening ceremony, and he uses that for the Paralympics at Stoke Mandeville. He really works hard to bring IOC members to watch the competition. And really, those Stoke Mandeville Games, that's the roots of the Paralympics. They don't really take off until the US comes over to England and competes. And Dr. Gutman, again, very much a self-promoter. He kept inviting the US to come over. And finally, they come over in 1955. And that really gets the movement in terms of competition, but in terms of numbers and publicity, that really gets it going, leading to what most people consider the first official Paralympics, which would be Rome 1960, following the Rome Olympics.
I mean, just a short span of time, it's just interesting how it's like wheelchair sports, Paralympic sports start developing at the same time in England, the US, and how quickly evolves into a Paralympic Games. You said it like just a decade afterwards, basically.
Right. So, and I think that that's due to the athletes themselves, but also people like Dr. Gutman, doctors here in the US. Dr. Gutman, he traveled all over. So he would go to, the European continent and help with spinal cord units in Italy and in France. He would go to Australia. And in his wake would come these ideas of athletes using wheelchairs to play sports. And the original, there's been some little controversy about where did the word Paralympics come from and what did it mean originally? And, according to the best scholars that who have tracked down this, it really was about paralyzed, para meaning paralyzed, or paraplegia, meaning wheelchair, in the beginning. And then it eventually expanded to beyond that. And one other note, just because obviously we're here in this, pandemic, of course, in the US, once it did get beyond the VA hospitals and then spread to what they called hometown teams in cities, they would start to have post-polio patients. So people who had polio but had to use a wheelchair, they would start playing wheelchair basketball and other sports. So it spread beyond just those war veterans.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, it's a legacy on sport. I mean, that's why we're also doing on just Veterans Day, just to
Right.
the relationship there. It's just, from veterans to Olympic sports. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, David, your book. It's like a hybrid of history and sports. No, and where can people find your book? I mean, is it Amazon, or where can people get it?
Yeah, Amazon is a good place to start. And I know there are a lot of people who like to use what we call independent bookstores over here. They can call their bookstore and order it. It's readily available, published by mainstream press, so it's not a academic press or anything. It's a mainstream press. But certainly Amazon is easy, but other bookstores have it. And you mentioned Veterans Day, obviously here in the U.S. Being a holiday, or where we pay respect and commemorate those people who've given their lives and fought for us. And really, we at the top of the show, we mentioned the gentleman who I met. His name was Jerry Fessenmeyer. I dedicated the book to him. I was fortunate enough that he was still alive when I started writing the book, and I got to meet him and hang out with him. And, we became friends. We would just talk on the phone every week. And, there's, let's just say there's no way he could, if you had asked him in 1948, hey, could you see this becoming this Paralympics? And no way. He didn't, Dr. Goodman saw that. But people who were just playing, it was for fun. It was for rehabilitation. It was to get a sense of control and normalcy back into their lives so that they could move on and have careers, get married, have kids, or in some cases adopt kids, as many of the veterans ended up doing. But to live a full and complete life in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, like, going back to that photo, I mean, I think that photo, again, it tells a lot, and what you just described is that as well. I mean, that's legacy, that's image also of like wheelchair sports, like you see like a wheelchair and a guy that it's athletic, and people change the perspective there. And I mean,
and if you don't mind, I'll just share the screen again just for a sec.
Yeah.
So this is the Rolling Devils team that I originally got my interest. These were the veterans from the Naval Hospital in Corona. And I want to point out a couple. So the gentleman on the far right with the number 1, that's Jerry Gene Fessenmeyer. He was wounded on Okinawa by a Japanese sniper, and he becomes one of the main characters in the book. The gentleman in the middle holding the ball, that's Johnny Winterholler. He was an amazing athlete from the University of Wyoming, and he was an ROTC guy. So he went to war. He went to the Philippines in 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, and then he was captured on Corregidor, and he was put in POW camps in the Philippines until 1945. He was never actually wounded per se. His body just wasted away because of lack of nutrition and medical care. And so this amazing athlete his legs were rendered useless. And just to finish the thought, the gentleman at the behind Johnny Winterholler with the gray shirt and the tie, that's Dr. Gray, Dr. Gerald Gray. And part of the book, as you say, I mean, it's a sports book, but it's also a book about the culture, the medical community, and how they were able to rally around and help these men. And Dr. Gray was trained as a plastic surgeon, but he saw the value of sports and the value of recreation and activity. And he was the one who said, hey, let's get these boys going, let's get our team going and have some fun. And sure enough, they did.
No, I mean, it's a lifesaver for these
Yeah, absolutely.
young, and I mean, again, and the legacy, we can see it right now. And again, the photo you just showed, that was my point. You know, you see the photo and your perception completely changes. And
right. And
I mean, yeah, it's a story of human adaptability. I mean, it's amazing.
Do we have time? Can I share another photo?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let me share another photo. So I mentioned the flying wheels that would barnstorm the nation every year.
Yeah.
And here, when they would play down in Virginia, the hospital in Virginia, they always stopped in Washington, D.C., and they would lobby congressmen. They would visit with the president, President Eisenhower one year, President Truman, Vice President Richard Nixon at the time. And they would lobby, they were all members, all of the teams and the paralyzed they were members of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, a group that they formed. And certainly in the beginning, they were lobbying for rights for themselves. And they were very successful. They were able to get Congress to pass bills for adaptive housing. They got a grant so that they could build homes with ramps, with lower bathrooms that they could, wheel their wheelchairs in, etc. And these were innovations, and that went beyond obviously sports, but it eventually went beyond paralyzed veterans. And when they would play exhibitions, that money went to research about paraplegia, and they were trying to find, a quote unquote cure. Of course, that's been elusive, of course, all these years. But it's interesting that it starts as basketball, but then it gets beyond basketball and it becomes something so much more, really.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned that earlier, like it's also it's a medical part as well. I mean, it's history, it's medical, it's a sport. And thank you, David, for sharing this story and being with us today. And please check out also the other book of David called, it's about Duke Kahanamoku. How do you pronounce his last name? He's from Hawaii.
Kahanamoku. But a lot of people have had, that's why they just called him the Duke.
The Duke, yeah. I mean, he has a surfer, Olympic swimmer, and he has a good, he also had a legacy on swimming and surfing. And he was an icon in the sport in the U.S., in Hawaii, and it's worth
and again, as your audience knows, they were going to have surfing for the first time in the Olympics in 2020 in Tokyo.
Yeah.
And I mean, my gosh. And and one last note, and I once I have some coffee, I keep going here, Ronnie. I just want you to know.
Sure.
But
yes.
The book basically goes to that, the narrative basically goes to the 1964 Paralympics in Tokyo. And that's why we had timed it to come out, in 2020. And of course, everything happened. But that was a really, again, exporting sports to, first of all, Rome in 1960 and then Tokyo in 1964. Those were the first two official Paralympics. I mean, very, very important milestones in the history of the Paralympics and the Olympics, and what it meant for people with disability to see, amazing athletic feats by people who just before were considered outcasts. So it really is a story of inspiration and courage, and hope, I guess, in these times.
Yeah, and well, please, guys, go to Amazon, go to your independent bookstore. David, good job, great stuff, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Ron.
And thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you all next week. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Cartan. Really appreciate it.